Welcome to act.tv. I'm Julianna. As we all know, in the aftermath of this pandemic, we are going to be involved in a major economic rebuilding. But that also means we have a chance to build new financial institutions that would prioritize the needs of the public. This is according to John Paraskevopoulos. Oh, I blew it. John, what's your last name again? You have so many letters. Pronounce your name for me, will you? I'm sorry. I want to make sure I get it right.
Sure, Paraskevopoulos.
According to John Paraskevopoulos, one surefire way to bolster the economy while making sure our basic needs will be met is through public banking. He's here today to talk about what that would look like. John is a paralegal at the New York Civil Liberties Union, a tenants' right organizer, and a member of the NYC DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America. John's prior work on the issue of financialization and issues of urban planning and racial inequity prompted his interest in public banking in 2016 as a means for helping resolve the crisis of affordability in the California Bay Area. John, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
So let's just start with the whole idea. Can you talk about public banks? What are they? How would they address some of the economic issues we're seeing now? And, maybe how might they address some of the issues we're about to see because of the pandemic?
Right. So I'll try to answer those in turn, but if I fall off track, just rope me back in. But those are great questions. So the first one, what is it? It's just like a public library or a public university or a public water utility. It is a bank that is just owned and operated by the government, and that could be a local government, that could be a state government, or a national government. It's just a bank that is run by and for the people, which seems simple enough, and it was actually an idea that was implemented a lot in the early United States when a lot of people really distrusted private banks and financiers. And so you had states like Vermont and Kentucky and Georgia, and two national banks of the United States. They were all creating their own banks in order to loan credit to the government, in order to fund public projects. So the second question was how it would help in our recovery. Is that correct?
Sure.
Yeah.
It works. Let me just get it straight. It works like a regular bank. I take my money over there and the bank uses it for it holds the money, it protects the money, it's FDIC insured, whatever, but it uses it for public works instead of for, investing in the stock market, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And so you see these massive sort of gaps left by the private financial system in that, here in New York City, there's nearly 1 million households that are unbanked or underbanked. People who, because of their citizenship status or because they, primarily work in the cash economy, aren't able to access banking services, might not have credit. And if you've tried looking for an apartment, it's nearly impossible to do without credit. You have a history of redlining and disinvestment in certain communities, especially communities of color, and you have a private financial system that is sort of systematically unwilling to invest in long-term public projects. Mm-hmm. So public bank is exactly like you said. It's just, it could be chartered to do certain things instead of others, right? Like the Bank of North Dakota, currently the only public bank in the United States, it's not really a consumer bank so much. You can't get a credit card there. But that doesn't mean it's impossible. It depends on the rules that you lay out for the bank. But exactly, they would take our tax revenue, and then instead of investing it in, the stuff that Wells Fargo and Chase and Citibank invest in, like private prisons and weapons manufacturing, they could invest our public money in publicly oriented things like a Green New Deal, infrastructure. And they could also just help local governments fund things that they need to do. If you need to build a school, if you need to build a bridge, you don't need to go and float bonds and have them underwritten by a private bank.
What are the limitations of private banks?
Well, one of the limitations of the private banking system is just like I said, that it really doesn't want to invest in things that don't return a high rate of profit. And that leaves out a lot of publicly oriented things. So banks always have to think about opportunity cost. They have to think, is it going to be worth a while to invest this chunk of change I have in building affordable housing, or will I make more money putting it on the stock market or investing it somewhere else? And so capital is always searching for yield, is what they say. And that leaves out a lot of things that aren't necessarily super profitable, but are needed, like building affordable housing. It's not going to turn 12% profit per year or whatever, but it's desperately needed, and it is profitable just with a smaller margin. Or investing in struggling businesses. Like right now, there are all these articles about how 40%, 50% of small businesses might fail. They desperately need credit. And the Paycheck Protection Program was, part of an effort to extend credit to struggling small businesses. But we could also just have a, Bank of New York City, a Bank of New York, or, whatever your state or city is, that can do that as well.
Would a public bank be beholden to the people who put the money in it? Or, it seems like a public bank is a good idea when it's not under Trump, because wouldn't Trump somehow be able to direct the funds toward his nefarious purposes anyway?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's a classic question. Should we give powers to the government if we don't trust the government, right? If there's a possibility for the government to be corrupt. And that's where I think just having good ground rules set matters. So with the current legislation pending in New York State legislature to legalize public banking, as it were, it's not that creating a public bank would necessarily be illegal, but we think it would be very useful to have a regulatory framework for how it should operate, right? Who it should be accountable to, who's the board of directors, who are they appointed by, and how can we make sure that those people are actually accountable to the communities that they serve. Mm-hmm. And I think if you create a public bank after creating a framework like that sort of will be immune to corruption, it can work very well. So I wouldn't trust, Trump to create to have his own bank. And even with the Federal Reserve now, we're seeing hundreds of millions of dollars being pumped into the in big corporations, and there's no accountability.
John, we have some questions coming in from the chat stream. Sure. Dot Gobbler says, when interest rates are so low, do public authorities really need a public bank? Not sure if that, maybe it goes to how would individuals as opposed to corporations benefit from using a public bank? Maybe it goes to that question.
Yeah, no, it's
a lot of re-explaining you got to do.
Yeah. That's a really good question. Part of it is that cities, local governments have a difficult time obtaining money even when interest rates are low. Debt has to be in many places approved by voters, right? If your local county government wants to build a school and they need, $50 million or whatever to do it, they have to issue bonds, and those bonds have to be approved by voters. And also, they're not going to do it if they fear that it might impact their credit rating. And so there are all these sort of like institutional obstacles that make it very difficult for local governments to sometimes get the money that they need, that they would otherwise be borrowing. Anyway, sort of the way local governments naturally do business. The other thing is that we need local governments to be resilient economically. So in 1975, you had New York City on the brink of bankruptcy, and they really just needed a loan in order to refinance their existing debt. And because they had to rely on the private financial system to buy their bonds and to extend them the money, the private financial system realized that they could just sort of hold the city hostage. You had the institution of austerity that the city has never really recovered from. Things like the tuition at the public universities, it's never been there before. And so even when interest rates are low, I think there's a variety of benefits. If anything, because we have tax dollars being paid to local government anyway, why not make sure our tax dollars aren't being invested in fossil fuels if we can put them in a public bank that will invest in the community, if that makes sense.
John, another question coming in from the chat. Is this the same as postal banking?
Postal banking, that's another great question. Postal banking is a type of public banking. And it comes down to like there are different types of banking. Usually the difference is retail banking, which is like what postal banking is. Like, can I go deposit a check, withdraw $500, get a line of credit, whatever, and then investment banking. And a public bank could do both. Postal banking is public banking, but it's only retail banking. And the United States had postal banking for about 50 years, from I think the early 1900s, maybe 1911, until the 1960s, 1963 or so. And it was very, very successful, especially in rural areas, especially in sort of disinvested neighborhoods and cities. And I don't think that they're mutually exclusive. It'd be great to have a public bank that could have more of an investment focus, or could provide retail services, or both, as well as postal banking, especially, which would be really useful in rural areas.
We're talking about public banking with John Paraskevopoulos, from paralegal from the New York Civil Liberties Union. John, can you talk about what we're about to see in terms of how COVID and civil unrest is affecting our economy, and how public banks could be, a saving grace around this?
Right. That's a great question, and it's part of what motivated me to write that op-ed. Is we have a lot of small businesses that I think form the part of the fabric of our communities. In many cities, at least here in New York City and around the state, small businesses. There's a lot of small business boosterism that can be in bad faith, but I genuinely believe that it's a great way for communities and families to build wealth, and for communities to have some kind of fabric and vibrancy, and margins in small businesses are really, really thin, and a lot of them aren't able to continue paying rent, to continue meeting their mortgage or other loans. And it would be very, what we might see is many of these businesses go under in the next 6 months, and in the next few months. Many of them might have already. And a public bank would be a very, very good way for them just to be able to refinance their debt or get short-term loans, similar to what the Paycheck Protection Program was doing. And what you saw in North Dakota was the public bank stepped in and they said, we're going to help local banks administer the Paycheck Protection Program. And you had North Dakota, of all places, because it has a public bank, get more Paycheck Protection Program funding per person than any other place in the country, faster, more, and a higher percentage of the loans approved. It was something like more than 80% of their PPP loans were approved, where in other places in the country, it's more like 40%, 50%. So a public bank would be a great way to step in, give businesses short-term loans. Another thing that we're seeing is just widespread unemployment here in New York. The unemployment rate is 18%. And a public bank could make large infrastructure investments or fund jobs programs that could put people back to work, at least in the short term, so that the economy doesn't enter into a demand side recession where people don't have the money to buy anything, and so things continue to fail.
Can you talk about some of the bills in the New York State Legislature that New Yorkers can support? And for those who aren't in New York, are there similar bills in other states?
Yeah, so in New York State, there are two bills pending. One is in the Assembly, the lower house, Assembly Bill A9665, which is sponsored by Thomas Avenanti, who represents an area just north of the city. There's another bill, I think it's S5665. Let me double check. No, that's S5565, which is sponsored by.
I was writing it down, but we did talk about it a little while ago. I'll put it in the chat.
Sure. And that's sponsored by James Sanders, who's from the Rockaways. And you can call your representative and just ask them to sign on to these bills and pass them while there's still some time left in session. If you want to get more involved, there's a coalition here in New York City, the New York City Public Banking Coalition. You can get in touch with them. They have a Twitter, they have a website. And in other states, there are nascent sort of efforts to get this off the ground. I don't know about individual bills, but in California, they passed a bill similar to the one currently pending in New York State Legislature in October of last year, and there are efforts already underway to create a public bank in the Bay Area and in LA. And so you can support those maybe online, or if you live there, by getting involved, contacting the people.
Absolutely. Well, John, thanks for joining us on the program today. I absolutely appreciate you doing the work that you're doing. Where would you suggest people go to find out more information about public banking?
The Public Banking Institute has a wealth of resources. They have a website, and the Public Bank NYC Coalition on Twitter, and the website there would be a great place to start.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate you joining us here on Act TV.
Thank you so much for having me on.